Hello and welcome to Bed Lullaby, where we hear, we calm, and we get sleep. I'm your host, Alisa. Thank you so much for tuning in. Tonight, we'll begin a dreamy retelling of the classic tale, Beauty and the Beast. It's a perfectly magical story to lead you into a good night's sleep. Let's just take a moment to settle in, release any tension, and embrace relaxation. Make yourself comfortable, and as you ease into stillness, let your breathing flow naturally, drawing out a little longer with each exhale. Focus on the soothing rhythm of your breath, letting it guide you into a calm and restful state. The slow, steady airflow becomes a mindful experience, preparing your body and mind for sleep. When I speak to you before each story, I share the words I wish I could hear when trying to relax and drift off. Falling asleep hasn't always been easy for me. Like many, I've had restless nights, but I've learned to stay calm and not let stress take over. Worrying only invites more wakefulness, so instead, I focus on gentle breathing to ease tension. As you listen tonight, use your breath to quiet stress and guide yourself into deep relaxation and peaceful sleep. A simple breath can calm your nervous system and lull you into rest. And with a dreamy bedtime story to accompany your journey, let yourself drift away. Without further ado, let's step into the enchanting world of Beauty and the Beast. There was once a merchant named Laurent who staked his entire fortune on a fleet of ships but lost them all at sea. Being a widower, he didn't have to take this news home to a wife. However, he had 6 children who had grown used to a life of relative privilege. When the debts were called in and rumors spread that the family was penniless, most of them took the news hard. As days turned into weeks and the ships didn't appear in the port, the merchant had to begin selling their fine furniture, their carriage, and even his daughter's jewelry and expensive dresses. They had to give up their richly appointed house and move to a cottage on the outskirts of town. Laurent was frequently away visiting business acquaintances and trying to find partners who might invest and help him rebuild his business. While he traveled, his children, who were 3 boys and 3 girls, were left to keep the house on their own. Although they were practically adults, the 3 boys and the 2 oldest girls were largely useless when it came to practical skills. They had become quite accustomed to a life of study and idle luxury. The youngest daughter, whose name was Camille, was the most willing to take on the necessary household chores now that they were without servants. Perhaps it was her more impressionable age, or perhaps it was that she had a sweeter, more steadfast temperament. Whatever the combination of factors, Camille did the best she could to learn the basics of running a household. Laurent, who was truly liked by the people in the village, did not have many friends. To make their situation worse, the 5 oldest children also made no effort to adjust to their new lives. They did nothing to prove themselves capable or to endear themselves to the neighbors who might have helped them. Camille, however, sought advice from the villagers about unfamiliar skills such as baking, sewing, gardening, and keeping chickens. Their wariness turned to genuine affection when they grew to appreciate her willingness to learn and to work hard. In this way, over time, she became the glue that held Lauren's household together. While the 5 older siblings struggled to accept their fate, unable to change, Camille ensured that they had a tidy home and that there was food on the table. One day, when the family had been living this way for nearly 2 years, Laurent received word that one of his lost ships had appeared in the port, cargo largely intact. The family rejoiced at this miraculous news, the older 5 siblings declaring that their lives among the villagers were finally at an end. Camille took pleasure in their happiness, but the news did not seem as important to her as it did to the others. She had come to love their small cottage with its tidy garden and the comforting aroma of baking bread. Although it would be a relief to see the rest of her family content, she was unsure as to whether she wanted to return to their former lives of idleness. She had become a person who liked being useful. In order to reclaim his property, Laurent had to travel to the port by horseback, a journey that would take a couple of days. Once there, he could arrange for the proper dispersal of his reclaimed wealth and hire a comfortable coach to bring him home. In anticipation of their improved fortunes, he asked each of his children what gift they would like to have from the city. The older siblings demanded finery, asking for silk shoes with sparkling buckles, hats with elaborate trimmings, velvet capes, bears, and jewels. Only Camille was silent, seeming to think very hard about what her request would be. When her father turned to her and told her to speak up, she hesitated briefly. "In truth, Father, I have always dreamed of seeing a rose," she said. "They do not grow in this part of the country, and they are so exotic and expensive. If you could bring me a single rose in any color, that would be lovely." He chuckled at the strange whims of his youngest, but readily agreed. Privately, he thought he would also bring her a necklace or some sort of bauble to go with the flower. The weather was fine on the morning of his departure. Camille took care to pack his saddlebag with provisions for his journey and wished him farewell with a somewhat tearful smile. The others were more cavalier, used to their father's travels, caring only for the gifts they could now expect upon his return. As he rode away down the sun-dappled forest path, Camille alone waited in front of the cottage until he disappeared. She had a strange feeling of misgiving, but she didn't want to sneak up. After all, their fortunes had obviously taken a turn for the better. His way to the port city, filled with anticipation of reclaiming his wealth and status. It was true, of course, that he had still suffered heavy losses, but with the cargo on his ship, he could seed a new business, perhaps building up to a new fleet of ships. His head was filled with dreams of the spices, silks, and other goods he might import in the future. It was devastating to him, therefore, to arrive and find his dreams dashed. The ship had reappeared with most of its cargo unharmed. However, word had spread quickly of his good fortune, and his many creditors had taken swift action. By the time Laurent had come to claim his property, it had already been distributed to pay his many debts. In vain, he contacted one merchant after another, asking for an extension on his considerable bills, but it was no use. At the end of the day, he was a man without debts but empty-handed. There was no money left for him to invest, and there was certainly no money to spend on the gifts promised to his family. He was so disheartened that he didn't even want to stay in the city overnight without properly provisioning himself, considering the weather, or sending any correspondence ahead of him. Laurent mounted his tired horse again and rode out of town, heading back down the provincial road that had brought him to the port that morning. Laurent was a few hours outside of the city when darkness fell and a storm descended. Lightning and thunder crashed all around him, and the wind gusted mercilessly, blowing limbs off the trees. Laurent's horse became frightened and bolted away from the main road, taking him into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late that he had been foolish to undertake this nighttime journey, Laurent began searching in the gusting wind for any sort of shelter, such as a cave. How long his horse wandered through the howling gale, he did not know. Finally, he saw a tall stone wall arise before him. He urged the horse onward, hoping he had reached a house where he might shelter. Arriving at the forbidding wall of rock, Laurent saw that it was not a house, it was the wall around an estate. A tall and imposing iron gate stood ever so slightly open. Having no time for good manners, Laurent dismounted and pushed the heavy, swinging gate wide enough to pull his horse through. Together, they slowly headed up a paved walkway that receded ahead of them into the swirling darkness. With leaves flying all around and rain pelting him from all sides, Laurent could barely see the massive structure that emerged ahead of him in the wicked gloom. It was a mansion, to be sure. Although his visibility was limited, he could see it had a grand approach and many large rooms with tall windows. It was a very intimidating place for a person to arrive uninvited, but he had no choice. He feared he could not survive the night without a roof over his head. Tying his horse up safely in a sheltered alcove, he walked to the massive front door and lifted the iron door knocker. He let it fall, hearing the sound echo through the gloom as if in response to the thunder. When there was no answer, Laurent took a deep breath and pushed the door inward with all his weight. It gave, and he found himself almost falling onto the floor of a grand entryway. Laurent lay on the cold flagstones for a moment, regaining his breath in the eerie stillness. He could still hear the rain lashing the front steps through the crack in the tall door, and thought to himself how glad he was that he'd found shelter for his horse. Rising in the semi-darkness, Laurent saw that he was in a grand reception area with a curved staircase ascending on either side. Suits of armor stood sentinel here and there. Ahead of him, there was a set of richly carved double doors. The silence inside the house was profound. You could have heard a pin drop. Yet, there was a light glowing around the cracks of the doors in front of him. After a few half-hearted efforts to call out to the occupants, he took another deep breath and walked toward the lighted room. Pushing the door slowly open, he entered inside and scanned the room. The fire was roaring in the cavernous hearth, and in front of it, a table was set for one with a few simple dishes, a carafe, and a large drinking glass spread across it. His gaze took him to the other aspects of the comfortable room. He saw upholstered chairs and tables carelessly stacked with books. Still, there was no sign of the owner. Laurent awkwardly sat down on one of the armchairs and waited for a few moments. Soon, he could not take his eyes from the dinner laid upon the table. The loaf of bread and the aroma of the roasted meat tormented him, and his stomach growled loudly. As minutes passed and nobody appeared, he soon gave in to his hunger. He seated himself at the table, first taking just a slice of bread, then slowly eating the entire meal. He passed an hour in contented silence. Perhaps, he thought, the owner was away from home and sheltering from the storm elsewhere. Taking a deep drink of the delicious liquid in the glass, he hungrily polished off the rest of the dinner. Yes, he told himself, the owner was away and would be able to explain himself in the morning. Upon finishing all the food, Laurent leaned happily back in his chair and drank the rest of the contents of the carafe. The fire danced before his eyes, crackling and popping with a comforting warmth. Draining the last drop from his large cup, he pulled the letter about his recovered cargo ship from his pocket. Just a short time ago, he had been so full of hope. Now, those dreams were gone again. He dropped the letter on the table and pushed it away without even realizing it. Laurent fell into a deep sleep. He slumbered through the night without dreaming. When he awoke in the morning, it took him a moment to remember where he was. The fire, which had long ago burned down, and the plates and glasses used the night before were still on the table. it appeared that his host had not yet returned home. Feeling sheepish that he'd entered a stranger's home without invitation, his embarrassment got the better of him. Rather than wait for the return of the owner, Laurent resolved to slip out of the house as quietly as possible and be quickly on his way. After all, he told himself, the dinner would obviously have gone to waste anyhow. Raising himself from the upholstered chair, Laurent moved across the chamber and pulled the double doors open. Light filtered weakly into the entryway, meeting the austere hallway so that he could see it much better than the night before. Stepping self-consciously into the foyer, he found himself tiptoeing between the vigilant suits of armor, as if they might come to life at any moment and bar his path. Peering around him at the twin carved staircases, he noted that their carpet runners appeared neglected and fussy. It was as if nobody had been living there for some time. He walked lightly across the flagstones to the enormous front door. He reached for the handles, pulled with all his might, and it slowly slid open again, revealing a misty courtyard outside. Squeezing himself through the crack and then pushing it shut behind him, he straightened his waistcoat and attempted to master some dignity. Escaping his forbidding refuge like a thief in the night felt wrong, but he would try to put this entire humiliating journey behind him. Making haste, he returned to the alcove where he'd left his horse tethered the night before. He was glad to find her well. He reached into his saddlebag to feed her an apple he had left over from the supplies Camille had packed for him. Then, untying the horse, he quietly led her down the stone path he had traveled in the whipping wind the night before. Looking behind him, he saw the mansion rising darkly into the growing daylight. It was an enormous chateau, long, beige, and rectangular. The building had a main center section and was flanked by identical wings on either side. The windows were tall and narrow, lining all the two large floors with a regimented appearance. They seemed to be staring down at him. The sloping tiled roof was thickly populated with chimneys. Turning away from the sight of the imposing chateau, he led the horse toward the front gate, taking in the overgrown gardens on either side of him. As he was nearing the end of the walkway, he spotted a particularly charming pergola that was overrun with rose bushes. Standing in the center of a round seating area was a rose bush, blooming the most stunning pink roses he had ever seen. All at once, he remembered his promise to Camille. Resolving to keep his word to his youngest daughter, he eagerly set to cutting the blushing roses from the bush with a knife he kept in his bag. One rose would not be enough to make up for the circumstances of his reappearance. He would take them all. Laurent was so absorbed by his task that he didn't hear footsteps approaching. However, as he backed away from the rose bush, now devoid of all its blossoms, He sensed he was being watched. Turning, he saw a tall, fierce-looking man glowering down at him, or at least he thought it was a man. The being who stood before him resembled a human, but was bristling from beneath a wilderness of facial hair. He had an abnormally tall and muscular build, obviously not prepared for company. He was wearing a wrinkled linen shirt and breeches, as if he had stormed over in a hurry. He appeared to be furious. "What do you think you are doing?" he said in a loud growl, like that of a wolf. Laurent froze, painfully aware of the bouquet hanging from his left hand. He stuttered out an explanation, saying that he thought nobody lived here and that he assumed the roses would not be missed. Then, seeing no change in the man's fearsome countenance, he finished weakly with the explanation that he had promised some roses to his daughter. The beastly man in the linen shirt waited in stony silence, as if considering his next words carefully. When he drew himself up to his full height, he said, "You took advantage of my hospitality without asking. You ate my dinner. You slept in my chair. All of this I was willing to overlook without confronting you. However, you have now taken every bloom from my most prized rose bush, a great personal meaning to me. There is not another like it, and each of those flowers is priceless in my estimation. I demand that you make an effort to compensate me for this." Hearing these words, Laurent felt his heart sinking. He shook his head in defeat and told the man that he could not pay anything at all. He had nothing to offer. The stony-faced host regarded him coolly. "In that case, you must work off your debt," he responded. "I am in need of laborers here at my estate." Laurent gawked at him, trying to formulate another suggestion. "But, sir," he protested, "I have 6 children at home. I cannot stay here with you. What will become of them?" The man appeared unmoved. "Either you work off your debt, or someone in your family must take your place," he said. "Take your roses. They are no good to me now. Return to your family and make your arrangements. I will expect you or your replacement to be here within a week. If you do not appear, I will find you." With that, the glaring, fierce-looking man turned on his heel and strode toward the house, never looking back. Laurent watched him disappear into the chateau. He could see no other option but to go home and tell his children what he had done. He did not know how, but he would have to make arrangements for them to manage in his absence. Perhaps when the man had calmed his temper, he would see sense and not keep Laurent in his service for too long. With the storm past and daylight on his side, Laurent was able to follow his path back to the main road and continue onward toward home. He rode steadily but slowly as he considered the news he'd have to share upon his arrival. It was a beautiful day, the mist lifted, and the early autumn sun showered him with warmth that felt out of place. The birds sang sweetly, as if nothing was amiss, but his heart was heavy, and he was hesitant about what was to come. He arrived home late that night. His children greeted him with excitement. After all, they were expecting gifts. Opening and closing his saddlebags, they playfully reached around to find the finery he had promised them. With regret, he instead offered each of them a rose. Camille took hers and smelled it with delight, admiring its perfection. His other 5 children demanded to see their real presents. That night, around the crowded kitchen table, Laurent told his children what had happened on his ill-fated journey to the port city. He related the loss of his remaining fortune, as well as the circumstances leading up to his current obligation to the owner of the mysterious chateau. When he concluded that he would have to return and work off his debt, the 5 oldest siblings were not pleased. They pouted, asking how they were supposed to manage in his absence. Camille alone was silent. She sat at the table with an unreadable expression, lost in thought. Finally, she called for silence. Her siblings looked at her with surprise, as Camille was usually not one to insert her opinion. Camille announced that she would return to the chateau to take her father's place. Laurent's eyes filled with tears. He protested that he could not and would not allow such a thing. However, Camille's sound reasoning was difficult to counter. Father is needed at home to support the family, she reasoned. I, however, can be spared. Furthermore, I do have some household skills and will be able to do whatever cleaning or cooking is allotted to me. No, she concluded, there was not another reasonable solution. It was she who would work off the family debt. It took a day or 2 for Camille to prepare her modest belongings for the journey. As the rose her father brought her began to wilt, she pressed it in a book to dry. She wanted to have a reminder of why she was leaving home to work for this beastly stranger on a distant and isolated estate. Camille was nervous about leaving behind everything she had known, but she was determined to make her father proud. The morning of Camille's departure dawned bright and clear. She and Laurent packed her things into a small cart that they hitched to their faithful man. The chateau would be a 2-day walk with the horse pulling the cart. Laurent knew of an inn where they could spend the night along the way. Laurent's siblings gathered in front of the cottage to see them off. Among them, there was a mixture of relief and unspoken admiration. They were glad that they would not be left to fend for themselves for very long. It was a somber journey for Laurent and Camille, The fine weather lasted all the first day, and their night at the inn was uneventful. However, the second day of their trip proved to be blustery and sullen, as autumn first began to stake its claim on the forest. The first of the fallen brown leaves blew across their path, and the wind whistled through the trees. Their faithful horse clocked along the road slowly, drawing them nearer and nearer to their destination. When Laurent spotted the turnoff from the main road that would lead to the chateau, his heart began to break more and more with every step. Sensing her father's sinking spirits, Camille bolstered her courage and smiled at him reassuringly. "Don't worry, father," she said soothingly. "I am a capable person. I will be fine." He nodded, hoping it would be true. Inevitably, they arrived at the gloomy entrance to the estate. Laurent knew the time had come. Pushing the gate open once again, he led the horse through the opening and approached the forbidding mansion for the second time. Camille stared openly at what lay before her. Both the elaborate overgrown gardens and the soaring, unforgiving walls of the house were grander than anything she had ever seen before. It was overwhelming but also beautiful in its austerity. As a girl who had grown up in a village, Camille was speechless over the sheer size of the place and deeply sensed its mystery and its permanence. The very stones seemed to slumber, as if they had long waited in secret, hoping to be rediscovered. She wondered what kind of work she would be required to undertake here, and hoped that it was not beyond her capabilities as the former keeper of a humble cottage. Laurent stopped the horse and cart when they reached the wide front steps. The wind gusted at them sideways as if to blow them away from the entrance of the building. Slowly, they ascended and lifted the heavy door knocker, letting it fall. Father and daughter stood at the steps and waited, expecting the ferocious man of the house to appear. To their surprise, the door was slowly opened by a boy. He appeared to be about 13 years old and was dressed simply in the clothes of a villager. Sticking his head out of the opening, he observed the pair with frank curiosity. Then, appearing satisfied by his findings, he nodded. "Is one of you the new servant?" he asked. Laurent was briefly taken aback, but he indicated that he had come to deliver his daughter, Camille, who would be working off the debt in her place. The boy nodded as if this was not at all surprising and tugged hard on the door, motioning for Camille to come inside. Then he told Laurent he could leave Camille's things in the grand foyer and go. With that, the boy scuttled off into the recesses of the house, presumably to announce that the new servant had arrived. With the wind at her back, Camille walked through the doorway and into her new life. It was an emotional parting for Laurent and Camille, but they both put on a brave face. Laurent's faithful horse turned homeward, the sullen skies weighing down on them. He did not look back until they were outside the gates of the chateau. Then, the swaying trees of the forest closed in behind them. Camille stood uncertainly in the echoing hallway. The gray light of the overcast day made its way into the room via tall windows above the door, but it did nothing to create a feeling of warmth. She suppressed a shiver, edging closer to the trunk that held her belongings. She told herself she would need to muster her courage and do her best. After a few minutes, the boy came running back into the hall and announced to her that the Baron had told him to take her to her room. With that, he cheerfully picked up her trunk and began lugging it up the large, curving staircase. Camille followed him, surprised that she was going up instead of down to a kitchen or lower room. Perhaps she would be lodging in the attic. To her surprise, the boy turned down the first grand hallway. They padded along the richly carpeted east wing of the chateau, their silent steps moving past staring portraits of nobles from bygone eras. It was as if they were permanent residents, and this strange girl was an unexpected intrusion. Camille was so busy looking at them that she almost collided with the boy when he finally stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. Camille followed him inside and was surprised to find herself standing in the most well-appointed bedroom she had ever seen. It was not overly large, and the furnishings were sober, but the canopied bed, the fine fabrics, and the rich wood trim were luxurious. While she surveyed the room, noting a cozy window seat and small dressing table, the boy announced he would start a fire in the grate. When it was crackling, he stood and dusted off his hands, grinning at her. "I'm Gabriel," he said, "and I help the Baron around here with this and that. I'm so glad you've come. It does get a bit solitary sometimes, and I could use some help with the day-to-day." Camille wasn't sure how to respond, although she wondered what exactly the day-to-day tasks would entail. Instead, she thanked him for the fire and asked when she would meet her new employer. Gabriel informed her that the Baron had indicated he would see her tomorrow and that he would explain her duties then. For now, the boy would be bringing her a simple supper and hoped she would rest well for the night. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Gabriel left the room and closed the door silently behind him. Camille gathered her senses and went about unpacking her things. She hung her clothes in the large wardrobe and carefully put her small number of books on a side table by the bed. Flipping open the volume on top, she looked at the pink rose that lay between its pages, smiling woefully to herself. She closed it again and pushed it to the side. Walking over to the window, she pulled the heavy drapes aside and tucked herself into the soft pillows of the window seat. From here, She had a sweeping view of the courtyard with its gardens growing wildly around the edges of the walkways and up the stone walls around the chateau. Twilight was near, and the wind blew debris across the paved yard, tossing it up here and there into small cyclones. Dark clouds scudded across the rising moon. Exhausted by the journey and by the newness of this life, she briefly dozed there, cocooned inside the curtains. She was awakened by a knock on her door. Pushing her way out of the window seat, she slowed her breathing purposefully and opened it. A tray lay outside with a simple dinner on it: bread, cheese, soup, and some hot tea. Looking up and down the hall, she saw nobody. Gabriel was light on his feet, that was certain. Taking the tray into her room, she set it on a small table by the fire. She found she was ravenous and ate every last bite. Then, barely bothering to get ready for bed, she pulled the coverlet back, crawled into the warm embrace of her sheets and pillow. It was less than a minute before she fell asleep. That night, Camille had strange dreams. She saw herself walking the dark halls of the chateau, following a large dog. The animal disappeared into different rooms, reappearing a few seconds later in the hallway each time. Trying to catch up with it, she came to a doorway where it had recently vanished. She looked into the room, and instead of a dog, she saw the back of a man sitting at a desk. The man began to turn in his chair, but before he could face her, she awoke. Sitting upright in bed, Camille saw that the fire had died down and the sun was shining in her window. As her waking confusion cleared, there was a knock at her door. Gabriel was standing outside with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Camille," he said politely. "I've brought you a bite of breakfast." Then, motioning in the general direction of the entryway, he added, "The Baron requests that you meet him in his study when you're finished." Camille nodded to the boy, took the tray, and he disappeared again. An hour later, Camille stood nervously at the door of the very room where her father had once eaten his stolen fireside dinner. Camille could hear paper shuffling around inside. She cleared her throat and knocked lightly on the door. The noises stopped, and she heard a chair scraping across the floor. Momentarily, the man with a copious amount of facial hair appeared. His features were unattractively prominent, and his face wore a natural scowl. He was a truly alarming sight, but Camille took care not to reveal her feelings. She dipped her head politely in greeting. The huge man peered at her appraisingly and nodded his ungainly head in return. Then he gestured for her to be seated in a chair by the fire. He lowered himself into the armchair opposite her. "I see that you are the one to work off your father's death." Are you familiar with basic household tasks such as cleaning and some cooking? He asked. Camille nodded, indicating that she was. The man appeared pleased by this and lifted a heavy ring of keys off a nearby table. As you can see, I am very short on help here. Gabriel takes care of my basic needs. His mother keeps me provisioned with bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he runs errands to town. But there is nobody else to manage the estate other than myself. I'm sure you can tell that by looking around. It's still too much work for just you and Gabriel, but we will make do. He paused, as if waiting for a reply. Camille was aghast at the idea of being the only housekeeper in this huge mansion, but she didn't think there was a point in saying so. The man continued, "These keys will open most rooms in the house, although there is little reason to use many of them. If you need something that Gabriel cannot get for you, please speak to me. Otherwise, I am not particular and would like you to make as many household decisions for yourself as possible. I spend most of my time in my study or in the library." Overwhelmed by the enormity of the job he was giving her, Camille could only nod, indicating that the interview was at an end. He stood abruptly. Camille rose from her seat, took the ancient-looking keys from him, and nodded. Then, as she made her way out of the room, he called after her, "Dinner is at 7 p.m. It would be very sensible if you would join me in the dining room." Camille bobbed her head, thanked him, and left the study. She stood somewhat bewildered in the echoing front hall, feeling at once that she was lost in it and also that it was closing in on her. Spreading the heavy keys across her open palm, she gazed at them reflectively. She was stirred from her reverie by the sight of Gabriel emerging from the shadows, grinning brightly in her direction. He asked if she would like a tour. She gratefully accepted, and so her adventure as the housekeeper at the chateau began. What Camille learned was that the employer lived alone and had for many years. Because of his fierce appearance, the people in the surrounding area feared him. They whispered unkind stories and spurned him rudely when he showed his face in public. Gabriel was the only person who connected him to the outside world. He had started by running errands for the Baron years ago, but he had soon come to love and appreciate the man behind the unapproachable visage. He insisted that the Baron's bark was worse than his bite. Now, Gabriel spent every day at the house, taking care of what necessities he could. At night, he returned to his family's small home on the outskirts of town. "Truly, miss," he insisted, "the Baron is a fair and kind-hearted man." Gabriel gave Camille a tour of the many rooms and corridors of the entire chateau, which was suffering from neglect throughout. Most of the rooms along the gloomy hallways were unused. Camille's keys opened bedroom after bedroom that were covered in dust sheets. The fireplaces were cold. Some rooms had not been used for decades or even centuries. Furniture and belongings were piled high in those places, laced with cobwebs. The windows filtered the light weakly from outside as the glass was coated in years of grime. As Camille discovered, there were just a few rooms that were used every day and left for her to try to clean and organize. Those included the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the front entryway. Most marvelous, however, was the library. Gabriel allowed Camille to peek into the library while the Baron was busy elsewhere, and she was astounded by it. It was a huge room with high ceilings and gold trim. Bookcases stretched all the way to the very top, lining every part of every wall except where there was a window. Rolling ladders perched at the end of each side of the room, ready to slide across the bookcase and allow visitors to reach any volume they wanted. It seemed there were too many to count, with spines in many colors of crimson, forest green, navy blue, and brown. Each begged to be shelved and perused at length. Camille was an avid reader of the few books she had possessed during her father's financial disgrace, but she had never seen or imagined a collection like this one. According to Gabriel, the Baron spent a large amount of his time here, and it did appear to be true. Tables throughout this lavish hideaway were piled with tomes that were open to particular pages or collected in groups. Two worn leather armchairs spoke of long hours turning their heavy pages. Gabriel told her solemnly that he was to always keep the fire going in the grate during the day. Camille imagined what it would be like to open one of these countless volumes and sink into a soft chair, inhaling the scent of the aged and ink-laden paper. It was intoxicating. Camille knew that the only way to make progress in this neglected house was simply to choose a place and begin. That first day, she and Gabriel dusted and tidied the front hall and cleaned the kitchen. Gabriel and the Baron had been making simple meals there for a long time, but much of the space was in need of attention. Camille was not an expert cook, but she took pleasure in making the kitchen shine again. She sent Gabriel to town with a list of suppliers to be delivered. Then, standing in the grand, silent kitchen, she began to work. Unused countertops were cleared of their dust, and pots and pans received a much-needed polish. The cold and empty space began to feel alive again. By the time she was due to sit down to dinner with the Baron, she had prepared a simple meal of roasted chicken. It was not complicated, but she was proud of it. With little time to tidy herself, Camille returned to her room. Gabriel had rekindled the fire there, and she used her pitcher and washstand to freshen up. Putting on her nicest dress, she walked to the window to pull the drapes for the night. She paused and peered out into the gloom. The courtyard lay silent, as if in wait. Nothing stirred, not even a bird. It was as if the grounds were under a spell of silence. She thoughtfully tucked the velvet curtains together and pulled herself away from the side. There was much to learn about this place, she thought. Then, lighting a candle, she made her way down the velvety twilight of the darkening hallway and slowly descended the wide stairs. The tall doors of the dining room were before her, and the space was very grand for two people. At one time, it had surely hosted glittering parties and showy formal dinners. Looking up, she admired the sparkling crystal chandelier that loomed over the chamber like a canopy of stars. Gabriel had set 2 places at one end of the long table, and the dinner had been laid out. She was the first to arrive. She did not have long to wait. The Baron's hulking shape appeared awkwardly in the doorway. He paused and nodded his head briefly in greeting. Then he motioned to the 2 place settings to indicate that she should have a seat. Camille gladly took one of the upholstered chairs. "I can see you have been hard at work with Gabriel today," the Baron commented, raising his eyebrows at the hearty dinner she had prepared. "He has borne a heavy burden these past years as my only help. I'm glad you will be here to take on some of his labors." Camille nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, my lord," she paused when he shook his head. "Please, you may simply call me Antoine," he responded. "I am lord of nothing now. Lord of this chateau and its pile of dusty relics," he jested darkly. Then, looking in her eyes, he said, "I'm sorry you were compelled to come here under such conditions, but I hope you will be comfortable. I try to be a fair man, and I'm glad of the company." Camille nodded and smiled briefly. "Would you like me to tidy the library tomorrow?" she asked. "I was not sure if you wanted me to go in there." The Baron thought briefly and nodded, saying that it would be fine. "You should feel free to borrow any book that you like from the room," he added. After all, in the words of Descartes, the reading of all good books is like a conversation with the finest minds of past centuries. "I think you will find that my library has quite an incredible capacity to provide any book you have ever heard of. It is rather magical in that regard." Surprised by his kind offer and civilized words, Camille observed her unfortunately looking employer while he ate. She had been at the chateau only a day, and her entire view of her situation had begun to change. She was the mistress of a large house with full independence to work as she chose, and she had just been offered entrance to a vast library. Perhaps this twist of fate was not going to be as grim as she had imagined. She regarded her plate quietly in the flickering firelight, hearing only the clinking of silverware on china. The Baron and Camille did not speak much during that dinner, finishing their food in respectful silence. Later, when she rested comfortably tucked into the crisp white sheets in her grand canopied bed, Camille felt hopeful. This isolated estate, a product of both hardship and hidden beauty, seemed to hold many intriguing secrets. She looked forward to discovering them in good time. Turning over on her side, she gazed sleepily at the drapes again, closed tightly against the night outside the window. Inside this chateau, there was a flame that was keeping the place warm. She could feel it. The next day, after tidying up the kitchen, Camille cautiously approached the library. She knew the Baron was in his other study, and it seemed like a good time to explore the marvelous room of books under the guise of cleaning it. Taking a duster, she began methodically moving around the stack of books and between tables, addressing neglected surfaces that had collected a layer of dirt over time. As she was about to move some stacked volumes aside, Antoine appeared in the doorway. "Please don't disturb any stacks or open books," he said. Camille apologized, backing away from the pile she had been touching. "No need to apologize," he reassured her. "I realize it looks untidy. It's just that I am researching and don't want to lose my place." Then he asked her if she had chosen a volume for herself. She responded that she had not and asked if he had any recommendations. Camille admitted that she felt unequal to the task of understanding such important works. She had come from a much less learned background than he. Antoine smiled, spread his hands wide, saying, "Awareness of ignorance is the beginning of wisdom." Seeing her confusion, he winked humorously and added, "That bit of wisdom is from Socrates." Striding across the room, he picked up a small volume on a lower shelf and handed it carefully to her. "Maybe you would like some of his other thoughts." He believed strongly that we should all ask a lot of questions. Camille took the book with a nod of thanks. Before she left the room, however, she turned and indicated that she did, in fact, have a question. "Would it be possible for me to engage some villagers to come and tidy the gardens before winter?" she asked. Antoine looked at her somewhat mournfully and shrugged. "If Gabriel can find anyone willing to venture onto the estate, you are welcome to do that. Unfortunately, most are afraid to enter the walls of the chateau. Many outlandish tales have been told about me over the years, which is why I find myself mostly alone." Camille frowned. How can you bear it? Does it not make you angry to be treated so unfairly? The Baron looked down thoughtfully and responded, I was once a better-looking man who was also vain and foolish. It took a great misfortune for me to see the error of my ways, and the scorn people have for me is probably just payment for my folly. Camille did not respond. She wouldn't ask any more questions today, but she was determined to find out more about how her employer had fallen into such an unfortunate state. For now, she was looking forward to reading Socrates in her room after dinner. Camille quickly adjusted to her new life as the housekeeper of the chateau and even came to love it. By sheer bribery, she was able to have Gabriel hire a few village men who came to the estate one day and rid the gardens of years of neglect. This was only after they received strict instructions from Camille not to hurt the rose bush by the pergola. Apparently, it had been planted by Antoine's mother and was very special to him. Antoine. They say he's an absolute monster, one exclaimed loudly to the other. Lives like an animal in there, another added. No manners and unfit for human company. But I'll take his money, the man finished rudely. Camille noticed Antoine standing by the window, listening to the entire exchange. She rushed to close it, anxious to spare him the men's heartlessness. He waved her off, apparently unconcerned. I'm used to this type of talk, he explained. It has been many years since I was able to circulate in society. Camille was nonetheless upset. How can you tolerate such unfairness? People who don't even know you? How do you not loathe them? He shrugged, gazing thoughtfully at a stack of books on a nearby table. A great English playwright named William Shakespeare once wrote, "Not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself." By bearing goodwill for these unknowing people, I ease the burden on myself. When he smiled and nodded at Camille, saying, "You might like to read Shakespeare yourself. He wrote some excellent plays." Camille smiled, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to Antoine's story than he was letting on. Despite the large amount of work that awaited her each day, Camille still made time to explore the house. As autumn properly set in with its crisp days, early sunsets, and chilly evenings, she would wander the corridors with a candle, using her heavy ring of house keys to find out what was behind the myriad closed doors that lined the halls. Most of them were bedrooms. It was obvious that this country chateau had once hosted many fine guests of nobility, but now, covered in dust sheets, one darkened room after another revealed elegant four-poster beds, expensive furniture, and dusty, fabric-covered chairs. One day, she found what appeared to be a very special room. It had clearly been a lady's chamber. Unlike the other rooms, however, it was still full of her belongings. A graceful dressing table was covered with jars of powder and perfume bottles that twinkled in the afternoon sunlight. Elaborate wigs, the type worn decades ago, sat nearby on their stands as if waiting to be taken to a ball. Opening the wardrobe, Camille was astounded to find a row of decadent silk dresses in the fashion of the time before the Revolution. She ran her hand lightly over their delicate skirts, almost afraid that they would disintegrate in her fingers. She imagined the elegant woman who must have worn them. Opening the chest of drawers, she saw that it was filled with glittering necklaces. One small velvet container held a ring with a twinkling sapphire in it. Closing the box, Camille slid the drawer shut quietly. She would not want to appear to be thieving. Regretfully, she slipped back out of the room and locked it again. It was like a portal to a happier time and by far the most beautiful thing she'd seen in the house. Camille faithfully wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel took to town when he ran errands. In them, she reassured him that she was being treated very well and that she enjoyed her work. Soon, she was even able to begin sending him some money. After her first month, the Baron told her that he couldn't let her keep working without pay, as the damage to the rose bush had certainly been made up for. He said that he hoped she would stay and that he would be giving her a weekly salary for the work. Camille gladly accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had found her calling. All her powers of organization were put to good use, and the excellent company and the access to his incredible library were becoming her chief joys in life. In fact, it was easy to forget that Antoine was considered unsightly. Nothing had changed about him except that Camille made sure his clothes were better kept and more presentable. Once in a while, however, she would see a normally nice-looking man reflected back at her in a mirror when he passed it on the wall. Or she would be speaking with him, and he would no longer be covered in hair, and his features would seem more harmonious. In such cases, she would blink a few times and refocus, only to see that he was the same fearsome-looking man as before. Perhaps the dark magic of the chateau was working on her mind. She smiled with wry amusement. Occasionally, a beggar would come to the door with the biting winter wind at his back. Not knowing anything about the notoriety of the estate, Camille expected Antoine to send them packing. But instead, he would ask her to give them coins before they left. Camille was moved to ask him why he exhibited such charity. After all, nobody who lived nearby showed any kindness to him. Lay unconcerned. "I'm used to this type of talk," he explained. "It has been many years since I was able to circulate in society. Camille was nonetheless upset. How can you tolerate such unfairness? People who don't even know you? How do you not loathe them? He shrugged, gazing thoughtfully at a stack of books on a nearby table. A great English playwright named William Shakespeare once wrote, "Not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself." By bearing goodwill for these unknowing people, I ease the burden on myself. When he smiled and nodded at Camille, saying, "You might like to read Shakespeare yourself." He wrote some excellent plays. Camille smiled, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to Antoine's story than he was letting on. Despite the large amount of work that awaited her each day, Camille still made time to explore the house. As autumn properly set in with its crisp days, early sunsets, and chilly evenings, she would wander the corridors with a candle, using her heavy ring of house keys to find out what was behind the myriad closed doors that lined the halls. Most of them were bedrooms. It was obvious that this country chateau had once hosted many fine guests of nobility, but now, covered in dust sheets, one darkened room after another revealed elegant four-poster beds, expensive furniture, and dusty, fabric-covered chairs. One day, she found what appeared to be a very special room. It had clearly been a lady's chamber. Unlike the other rooms, however, it was still full of her belongings. A graceful dressing table was covered with jars of powder and perfume bottles that twinkled in the afternoon sunlight. Elaborate wigs, the type worn decades ago, sat nearby on their stands as if waiting to be taken to a ball. Opening the wardrobe, Camille was astounded to find a row of decadent silk dresses in the fashion of the time before the Revolution. She ran her hand lightly over their delicate skirts, almost afraid that they would disintegrate in her fingers. She imagined the elegant woman who must have worn them. Opening the chest of drawers, she saw that it was filled with glittering necklaces. One small velvet container held a ring with a twinkling sapphire in it. Closing the box, Camille slid the drawer shut quietly. She would not want to appear to be thieving. Regretfully, she slipped back out of the room and locked it again. It was like a portal to a happier time and by far the most beautiful thing she'd seen in the house. Camille faithfully wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel took to town when he ran errands. In them, she reassured him that she was being treated very well and that she enjoyed her work. Soon, she was even able to begin sending him some money. After her first month, the Baron told her that he couldn't let her keep working without pay, as the damage to the rose bush had certainly been made up for. He said that he hoped she would stay and that he would be giving her a weekly salary for the work. Camille gladly accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had found her calling. All her powers of organization were put to good use, and the excellent company and the access to his incredible library were becoming her chief joys in life. In fact, it was easy to forget that Antoine was considered unsightly. Nothing had changed about him except that Camille made sure his clothes were better kept and more presentable. Once in a while, however, she would see a normally nice-looking man reflected back at her in a mirror when he passed it on the wall. Or she would be speaking with him, and he would no longer be covered in hair, and his features would seem more harmonious. In such cases, she would blink a few times and refocus, only to see that he was the same fearsome-looking man as before. Perhaps the dark magic of the chateau was working on her mind. She smiled with wry amusement. Occasionally, a beggar would come to the door with the biting winter wind at his back. Not knowing anything about the notoriety of the estate, Camille expected Antoine to send them packing. But instead, he would ask her to give them coins before they left. Camille was moved to ask him why he exhibited such charity. After all, nobody who lived nearby showed any kindness to him. And you should take all the time you need. As she thanked him for giving his permission, she once again did not see a beast looking back at her. She only saw a man. She had to blink several times to dispel the illusion. As she left the room, she paused briefly, gazed at him again over her shoulder, and then left him to his reading, putting the moment behind her. Her journey to and from her sister's wedding was uneventful. The family greeted her with much curiosity and perhaps some newfound respect. They admired the tasteful new clothes she acquired using her salary. It was obvious that the money she was sending to them had helped secure her sister's marriage, humble though the match might be. Her family was no longer seen by the villagers as being impoverished. Rather, they were viewed as stable and acceptable, thanks to her regular income. Yet Camille felt less at home in the family cottage than she once had. Although she had been contained inside the walls of the chateau this entire time, she felt like her worldview had changed and her horizons had vastly expanded. Seated around the fire with her siblings, who focused only on their own petty concerns, she felt stifled. She regretted having to leave her father again, but Camille also felt relief when he parted from her at the gates of Antoine's estate. She was ready to return to her life as the mistress of the house. Her happiness, however, turned to dismay when she saw the disarray that awaited her. Gabriel answered the door eagerly, obviously delighted that she had returned. He whispered to her that nothing had been the same since she had left. The Baron was disheveled and had not left his library. After putting away her things, Camille went straight to see Antoine. As she cautiously opened the door to the library, she found her room in a complete mess. Books were everywhere, lying open in stacks, generally tossed about the floor. Empty drinking glasses lined the tables. Antoine sat slumped in a chair, looking as if he hadn't changed his shirt in days. At the sound of her arrival, however, he looked up with an expression of sheepish relief. Once again, in this moment, Camille felt that she only saw him as a regular man, and she struggled to adjust her view. She knew logically that she was standing before an unkempt, unshaven, and rather beastly person. However, her eyes were playing tricks. It took a moment before she saw him properly again. Yes, there he was, in dire need of cheering up. It only took a few days for Camille to set everything right again. Dust and neglect from a couple of weeks were easily dealt with, and the Baron's mood improved instantly upon her return. Gabriel begged her in confidence, however, to go away again. He said the Baron had sunk immediately into the most terrible melancholy and had been completely useless about managing anything at all, including remembering to eat his meals. With spring bursting out all over the estate, it was impossible to be sad for long. Camille became very glad she had taken the trouble to have the garden cleared before the winter. The courtyard was absolutely beautiful, and the lovely plantings, designed many years ago by Antoine's mother, once again shone to their best effect. Flowers in a rainbow of colors delicately presented themselves. The bees seemed to increase their number by the day, singing sweetly in the morning, inviting the residents of the chateau to garden. Camille and Antoine took to spending afternoons reading outside in the pergola, and he often released Gabriel from his tasks early so that he could enjoy the afternoon with friends. Camille also took great pleasure in opening the windows of the stuffy mansion and airing it out. Throughout the estate, life began to feel fresh and new, as if the entire place had turned a corner. As the summer grew near, Camille received another message from her father. It seemed that her other sister was due to wed. Once again, she was invited to attend the event. Camille was torn. She felt obligated to be with her family for the nuptials. She couldn't imagine leaving Antoine once again. Faced with this dilemma, she came up with a highly unusual plan. She suggested to Antoine that he should escort her to the wedding and take a room at an inn nearby. Not view him as being terrible anymore. She only saw the wise, kind man that she had come to know. Surely, she thought, the people at home would give him a fair chance. The strangeness of a lord attending a village wedding did not even matter to Camille. She had long ago stopped seeing Antoine as either beast or baron. He resisted and refused, but Camille said she would not go without him. Faced with the prospect of causing her to miss her sister's wedding, Antoine finally agreed. He seemed to dread the prospect, however, and was in a dark mood as the planning went forward. Camille would not be deterred. She sent Gabriel to the tailor in town, requesting that a new and well-cut suit of clothes be made to Antoine's measurements. It had not escaped her notice all this time that he was wearing the frivolous styles from decades before. The new fashion these days was cleaner and simpler. He would have a dignified suit that made him look less like a relic. Rooms were cleared, and the carriage was dusted off. Finally, the day came that Gabriel wished the pair well on their journey. He had never seen the Baron leave the estate. He promised to keep everything from falling apart before their return. The journey to Camille's village was speedy by carriage. The distance was covered in just a day, and what a fine one it was. Summer was showing its face with verdant exuberance as the horse clicked and clacked down the road through the forest. The sun joyously shone from the canopy of foliage overhead, bright rays of sunshine lighting the road ahead of them, while the breeze whispered beguilingly through the trees. At first, Antoine was silent, as if passively resisting the reality that he was accompanying Camille somewhere in public. After a few miles, however, the pair slipped into conversation about a book Camille had been reading. Soon, they were having their usual lively exchange. Camille smiled to herself, seeing the best in him come out. Looking at him from the side, she could have sworn she was sitting next to a charming fellow. Happy with that idea, she did not try to dispel the magic. Inevitably, their companionable journey came to an end. Twilight fell, and the crickets began to serenade the fields with their nightly song. Antoine and Camille pulled up at her family's cottage and halted the carriage. By the time they had climbed down from their seats, the entire family was at the front door. All four of her remaining unmarried siblings were gawking rudely at them both. Laurent made a much greater effort to contain himself. He stepped forward and nodded politely to Antoine, thanking him for bringing Camille and for honoring them with his visit. However, Camille felt her cheeks grow hot with shame when her brother loudly whispered something to her older sister, causing the silly girl to laugh. It was obvious to everyone that they were making jokes about the Baron. It was a relief to everyone when Antoine departed for his lodgings. Camille allowed herself to be ushered inside, where she spent the evening talking with Laurent and her siblings, asking politely about the wedding preparations. She was worried, however, about how Antoine was faring at the inn and hoped he was not suffering ill behavior there. When her head lay on her pillow that night, Camille drifted off to sleep with thoughts of Antoine weighing heavily on her. She realized she would be glad when they'd gotten through this wedding and returned to the chateau, which she now felt was her real home, and one that felt grim when he arrived at the church the next day. It was obvious that Camille's fears had come true. They sat in silence during the ceremony, both feeling as if they were being stared at the entire time. The small church felt tiny with the whole congregation scrutinizing them. The celebration afterwards was on the village green. The party was simple but festive, with punch, cakes, and wildflowers. Cream-colored happy atmosphere ladies gathered in groups delicately eating sweets, while children tumbled across the lawn enjoying an afternoon of play. Camille and Antoine, however, did not feel part of the celebration. She stayed at his side, stiffly nodding to the villagers who had once been so kind to her. The welcoming people who had taught her to garden and bake years ago were now standing at a distance, whispering behind their hands and nodding knowingly in her direction. Not one neighbor had a polite word for Antoine, who smiled at all and said nothing. Her family was no help. They ignored the pair completely. As Camille and Antoine stood fervently wishing for the party to end, they overheard two men speaking nearby. "You may have money," one said with a smirk, "but he'll never convince anyone to marry him with a face like that." The other man laughed. "Sad state of affairs when you have to court your own maid," he responded. Those words were the last straw. Camille put down her punch and walked to the center of the gathering, tersely announcing that she had something to say and that everyone must listen. "I convinced the Baron to come with me because I thought you to be good people," she said. "I was sure that his fine character and his kindness would make it obvious to you all that he is not the beast people make him out to be. Well, I'm ashamed to say that I was wrong. None of you are worthy of his notice. We will trouble you no longer. Let me tell you this, Antoine is a better man than any other here. I would choose him as a companion over every single one of you 100 times over, and that's the truth." The company was completely silent, looking in bewilderment from Camille to Antoine and back again. As she turned to face him, she saw the strangest thing. Where he had stood, a handsome, dignified man stood, smiling gratefully in her direction. No matter how many times she tried to adjust her view or clear her head, his visage did not change. He was as handsome as any man she'd known, and that did not change. Whether it was a shift in perspective or all the workings of an enchantment, the other people at the party seemed to be going about their celebrations as if nothing had happened. They greeted Antoine warmly and smiled at Camille as if nothing in the world was amiss. It was as if the entire embarrassing episode had never occurred. The villagers behaved for all the world like they'd never seen a beast in their company. It was both baffling and miraculous. A veil had been lifted. For good, this quiet moment of triumph was how Antoine was finally released from his enchantment. All these years, he had been seeking answers in his library, researching the wisdom of humanity. But he had misunderstood the woman who had cursed him. Those lonely decades of becoming kinder, more generous, and more forgiving had created in him the humanity that had won Camille's heart. That was the missing piece that had freed him from his curse. Not long after, Camille and Antoine sat together under the pergola in his garden, admiring his mother's rose bush, which was blooming abundantly once again. Twilight was descending upon the chateau, and the crickets were emerging to serenade the world as the happy pair enjoyed the balmy summer evening. Camille considered this glad new Antoine, appreciating his handsome face so long hidden behind the guise of the beast. As she watched, he sat up straighter and reached into his pocket, pulling out the very ring she had secretly admired in his mother's dresser. "You were the only person who took the trouble to get to know me as I really was," he said to her. Then, in his way, he fell back to a quote from one of his many books. As Copernicus said, "In the middle of everything is the sun. You have become that sun." Winking at her, he added, "After all, I think you have adequately demonstrated that you are more than qualified to manage this chateau." Camille laughed and nodded her agreement, allowing him to slip the sparkling blue gem onto her finger. Gazing at it in wonder, she remembered the moment she had first seen it in the mysterious bedroom among the fine dresses and the other jewels. It winked at her in the sunlight as if to communicate a precious secret. She would now be part of the history of this house. Before the end of the summer, Antoine and Camille exchanged their vows in the courtyard of the chateau, surrounded by the heavenly scent of the flowering rose bushes and the sweet song of the birds from the treetops. As they stood in the shadow of the house, Camille looked at Antoine with a grateful heart and felt a strong sense of belonging in a place she had once found so foreign. This was no longer the same desolate place where she had arrived just a year ago. Through kindness, patience, and the search for wisdom, she and Antoine found happiness.